What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved and mysterious actors walks into what should have been a simple morning talk show, only to find himself caught in the middle of one of the most heated, uncomfortable, and shocking live television confrontations ever aired? What was supposed to be an easy, lighthearted promotional interview quickly spiraled into chaos, leaving the audience stunned, the hosts divided, and security scrambling to control a situation that no one saw coming. This is the unbelievable story of Johnny Depp's disastrous appearance on The View, an interview that began as a friendly chat and ended as a defining, career-shaking moment that the internet still can't stop talking about. That morning, Johnny Depp arrived at the ABC studios with his usual quiet confidence. Dressed in his signature layered scarves, tinted sunglasses, and weathered leather jacket, he exuded that effortlessly cool energy that had made him one of the most recognizable figures in the world. He wasn't nervous. He had done hundreds of interviews over the years. Morning shows, late-night talk shows, film junkets, you name it. This was supposed to be just another stop on the promotional trail for his latest film, a project he was genuinely proud of. The plan was simple: talk about the movie, maybe share a funny behind-the-scenes story, exchange a few laughs with Whoopi Goldberg and the panel, and be on his way to the next engagement. As he entered the studio, the audience erupted in applause. You could feel the excitement in the air. People had grown up watching Johnny Depp on screen, from Edward Scissorhands and Pirates of the Caribbean to his more recent dramatic roles. He was a Hollywood icon. The camera zoomed in as he took his seat on the couch, that familiar grin lighting up his face. Everything seemed perfectly normal, at least for the first few minutes. But things changed almost immediately once Behar took the lead. Known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude, Joy wasn't interested in sticking to the script. While Whoopi started off with a few polite questions about Johnny's new film, its themes, his creative process, the challenges of production, Joy pivoted in an entirely different direction. She began to press him about his personal life, about his past controversies, about headlines that had dominated tabloids for years. It was the kind of territory most shows avoided if they wanted the guest to stay comfortable. But Joy, true to her reputation, didn't hold back. The tension was subtle at first. Johnny tried to deflect with humor, laughing off the questions, keeping his tone calm and charming. But as Joy pushed harder, questioning his credibility, bringing up old accusations, and interrupting his attempts to respond, the atmosphere began to shift. The audience grew quieter. Even the other hosts seemed unsure of how to step in. You could see the frustration building in Johnny's expression. His jaw tightened slightly behind his smile, and his fingers fidgeted with the silver rings he always wore. Finally, after one particularly invasive question, Johnny leaned forward and said something that completely changed the tone of the interview. His voice was calm but firm, the kind of tone that demanded attention. "Joy," he said, "I came here to talk about my work, not to relive headlines that people twisted years ago. I've spent my life telling stories. Maybe today's not the day for another one." The room went silent. Even Joy looked momentarily taken aback, but instead of de-escalating, she doubled down. "Well, Johnny, if you're not ready to talk about the truth, maybe that says something in itself," she shot back. That was the moment things truly unraveled. The crowd gasped. Whoopi shifted uncomfortably, and the producers behind the cameras began frantically signaling for a commercial break that never came. Johnny's smile vanished. He took off his sunglasses slowly, placed them on the table, and looked directly at Joy. What followed was a brief, tense exchange, the kind that makes live television both electrifying and terrifying. "You call it the truth," he said, "but you're not interested in the truth. You're interested in a headline. You want a reaction, and I'm not going to give you one." But of course, by then the reaction was already happening. The energy in the room had changed entirely. Joy tried to regain control, insisting she was just doing her job, while Johnny calmly rose from his seat. Security began moving toward the stage, unsure whether to intervene or let the situation diffuse naturally. The audience didn't know whether to clap, stay silent, or record the moment on their phones. It was live chaos, raw, uncomfortable, and impossible to look away from. As Johnny started to walk off the set, Whoopi Goldberg stood up and tried to calm things down. "Johnny, hang on, let's just take a breath," she said, putting a hand on his arm. But it was too late. The damage was done. He gave her a polite nod and said softly, "No worries, Whoopi. You've always been good to me." And then he left, right in the middle of the broadcast. The producers quickly cut to a commercial, but by then, social media had already exploded. Within minutes, clips of the confrontation were circulating online. Fans were divided. Some defended Johnny, saying he'd been ambushed on live TV and treated unfairly. Others sided with Joy, claiming she had every right to ask difficult questions. Hashtags like #ClauderTeamJohnny and Joy Behar meltdown started trending across X, formerly Twitter, TikTok, and YouTube. Everyone had an opinion. Everyone wanted to weigh in on what they'd just witnessed. By the time the show returned from the commercial break, Johnny was gone, and the hosts were visibly shaken. Whoopi did her best to steer the segment back to neutral ground, but the tension lingered. Joy offered a brief, half-hearted comment about things getting a little heated, but viewers could tell there was more behind her words. Later that day, The View released an official statement calling the incident an unfortunate misunderstanding, though insiders claimed that ABC executives were furious about how the situation had been handled. For Johnny, the fallout was equally dramatic. Some entertainment outlets painted him as volatile, while others praised him for standing his ground. Yet those who truly knew his history saw it as something else, not a meltdown but a moment of human exhaustion. After years of being scrutinized, questioned, and misrepresented, maybe this was the breaking point. Maybe it wasn't about anger at all, but about finally saying enough. In the end, Johnny Depp's appearance on The View became more than just another viral clip. It became a conversation about media ethics, celebrity vulnerability, and the fine line between journalism and provocation. It reminded audiences that even the most polished stars are still human, and that sometimes when pushed too far, even the calmest soul can snap under the weight of constant judgment. So as viewers replay that explosive clip again and again, one question remains. Was Johnny wrong for walking out? Or was he simply defending his dignity in a world that often forgets the humanity behind the headlines? The studio lights glowed warm and steady as the cameras rolled, their beams reflecting off the polished desk of the View set. The audience buzzed with excitement. This was no ordinary guest. This was Johnny Depp, the Hollywood icon whose very presence seemed to carry the weight of decades of cinematic magic. When he walked onto the stage, the crowd erupted in applause, cheers filling the air like a wave of nostalgia and admiration. "Welcome back to The View, Johnny," Whoopi Goldberg began with her signature warmth, her tone calm and genuine. "It's always great to have you here." Johnny smiled, that easy, disarming grin that had melted hearts since the early Pirates of the Caribbean days. "Thanks for having me, Whoopi," he replied, his voice smooth but relaxed. "Always a pleasure." He adjusted the silver rings that glimmered on his fingers, a familiar gesture for anyone who'd followed his career, part habit, part armor. He leaned back slightly, seemingly at ease, but while Whoopi's tone was light and welcoming, something in the air felt off. Joy Behar, seated just a few feet away, was unusually still. Her papers were neatly stacked in front of her, too neatly. She wasn't smiling. Instead, she wore an expression of quiet calculation, eyes sharp and focused on Depp like a hawk preparing to dive. From the moment the camera started rolling, it was clear that she had a different plan for this segment, one that had nothing to do with promoting Johnny's new film. "So, Johnny," Joy began, cutting into the space just as Whoopi was about to continue. Her voice was crisp, her tone deliberate. "Let's talk about your recent legal troubles and how they've affected your ability to get work in Hollywood." The words dropped like a thunderclap. The studio fell silent. It wasn't the kind of question audiences expected from a morning talk show. There were no laughs, no warm-up banter. Even the audience, once cheering, went still, as if the air had been sucked out of the room. Johnny's smile faltered, just slightly, but his composure held. Years of interviews, interrogations, and public scrutiny had taught him to keep his mask steady. He inhaled softly, exhaled through his nose, and answered with measured calm. "Well, Joy," he began, choosing his words carefully, "I'm actually here to talk about my new film. It's a project I'm proud of, one that I think people are really going to enjoy." His tone was polite but cool, his attempt to steer things back to neutral ground obvious. But Joy wasn't having it. She leaned forward, elbows on the table, her papers forgotten. "But surely," she pressed. You can understand why people might be hesitant to support your work, given everything that's come out. The tension in the studio was now unmistakable. Sunny Hostin shifted uncomfortably in her seat, glancing from Joy to Johnny, unsure whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. Sarah Haynes looked down at her notes, clearly wishing the ground would swallow her whole. And Whoopi, ever the moderator, tried to step in. Joy, maybe we should, she began gently, but Joy cut her off sharply. No, Whoopi. I think this is exactly what we should be discussing, she said, her tone firm, almost combative. This is The View. We don't shy away from tough questions. Johnny's jaw tightened. Johnny, Joy continued, you've made millions of dollars from fans, especially women fans, and now many of them feel betrayed. What do you say to them? The words hung in the air, heavy and provocative. The camera zoomed slightly closer to Depp's face, capturing the flicker of frustration in his eyes. Years of media training had taught him to stay calm, but Joy's line of questioning wasn't just direct. It was personal. There was something almost performative in her tone, as if she wasn't just talking to him but to the millions of viewers watching at home. Johnny took a breath, straightened his posture, and replied evenly. I'd say that people should focus on the art, not the artist's personal life, he said, his voice steady. I've always tried to bring characters to life that entertain people. That's what I'm here to talk about. Joy didn't blink. She pounced on his words instantly. But you can't separate the two, can you? She shot back. When you ask people to pay money to see your films, you're asking them to support you personally. And given your track record with relationships, she paused for effect. Don't you think that's a problem? A ripple of murmurs passed through the studio audience. You could feel the collective discomfort, the awkward shifting in chairs, the uneasy glances exchanged between hosts. Johnny's expression changed. His smile was gone now. He looked directly at Joy, his tone no longer just polite. It carried an edge. My track record? He repeated slowly. Joy, I came here to discuss my work, not to be put on trial for my personal life. For a brief moment, the silence was deafening. Well, maybe that's the problem, Joy said coolly, leaning back with a self-satisfied smirk. Maybe you think you can just show up places and charm your way out of taking responsibility for your actions. The crowd reacted audibly this time, a mix of gasps, low murmurs, and awkward laughter. The other co-hosts looked visibly uncomfortable. Whoopi rubbed her temple, clearly trying to diffuse the situation before it completely spiraled. Joy, come on, she said firmly. That's not what this is about. But Joy didn't respond. She was staring straight at Johnny as if daring him to react. Johnny leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. With all due respect, Joy, he said softly, his voice calm but razor-sharp. I've faced courts, critics, and crowds, and none of them have the right to define who I am. Not today. The audience broke into spontaneous applause. Some clapped out of support, others simply to break the unbearable tension that filled the room. But Joy's expression didn't change. Well, she muttered, pretending to laugh, I guess we hit a nerve. Johnny smiled, but this time, it wasn't the warm movie star smile the world was used to. It was colder, harder, the smile of a man who'd decided he was done playing along. No nerves, he said quietly. Just boundaries. Whoopi stepped in again, signaling the producers for a commercial break, but the damage had been done. The atmosphere on set was fractured, uncomfortable, electric. Within hours of the segment airing, social media would explode. Clips would flood timelines. Hashtags like Jar Johnny Depp on The View, Jar Joy Behar out of line, and respect boundaries would trend across platforms. Fans and critics alike would dissect every frame, every facial expression, every word exchanged. Some would call Johnny brave. Others would call him defensive. But one thing was undeniable. This interview had just become one of the most talked about moments in The View's history. And as the cameras cut to commercial, Johnny Depp sat back in his chair, took a slow breath, and gave a small nod. The look of a man who'd walked through fire before and wasn't afraid to do it again. The tension in the studio had reached a breaking point long before anyone realized it. What had started as a promotional interview for Johnny Depp's latest film had now become something entirely different. A verbal battlefield unfolding live on national television. The audience, once cheerful and clapping, now sat frozen in uneasy silence. Every camera operator, every producer, every co-host knew this was no longer an interview. This was a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and debated for years to come. Sunny Hostin, sensing that things were spiraling out of control, finally tried to step in. Her tone was calm, careful, like someone defusing a bomb. "Johnny," she said with a gentle smile, "tell us about working with your co-stars on this new project. What was that experience like?" It was an attempt to shift the energy, to pull the conversation back into neutral territory. But Joy Behar wasn't ready to let go. She straightened in her chair, waved a dismissive hand, and cut Sunny off mid-sentence. "We'll get to that," she said sharply, not even looking at her co-host. Her gaze stayed locked on Depp. "But first I want Johnny to explain to our audience why they should trust him again." A murmur swept through the crowd. The shift in tone was unmistakable. This wasn't curiosity anymore, it was accusation. Johnny's composure, so steady throughout most of his career, was beginning to crack. He took a deep breath, leaned back slightly, and tried to keep his voice calm. "Joy," he began, "I'm an actor. I make movies. People can choose to watch them or not. I'm not running for president here," but Joy was relentless. "You're asking for people's money," she countered. "Their emotional investment. And frankly, I think a lot of our viewers are wondering if you deserve it." The words hit like daggers. The tension was now thick enough to taste. Camera operators instinctively began moving in for tighter shots, knowing instinctively that something major was happening. Every eye in the studio, from the control room to the live audience, was fixed on the two of them. Whoopi Goldberg, ever the voice of reason, looked ready to intervene again, but Johnny spoke first. His tone was no longer soft, and it carried weight now, quiet but razor-sharp. "You know what, Joy?" he said evenly. "I think you made up your mind about me before I even walked in here. This isn't an interview. It's an ambush." Joy smiled, a tight, performative smile that didn't reach her eyes. "It's accountability," she snapped back. "Something you seem to have trouble with." That was the moment everything changed. Depp's eyes narrowed. His voice dropped to a low, dangerous calm, the kind that made the air in the room feel heavy. "Accountability," he repeated slowly. "From someone who makes a living tearing people down on television." "That's rich, Joy," the audience gasped audibly. A ripple of shock moved through the crowd. Even the other hosts froze. This was no longer polite sparring. This was raw emotion breaking through. Joy leaned back in her chair, feigning innocence, but her eyes gleamed with a kind of thrill. She'd finally gotten a reaction. "Oh, so now you're going to attack me personally?" she said with mock offense. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is exactly what I'm talking about. The minute someone asks Johnny Depp a tough question, he gets defensive and starts lashing out." "I'm not lashing out," Johnny said, his voice rising slightly as his hands gripped the arms of his chair. "I'm pointing out the hypocrisy of someone who profits from controversy, lecturing me about accountability." "Okay, let's all take a breath here," Whoopi interjected, trying desperately to calm the situation. But Joy waved her hand again, cutting her off. "No, Whoopi, I want to hear what Johnny has to say." "Go ahead, Johnny. Tell us how you really feel about critics." Johnny leaned forward, his expression hardening. The relaxed charm that usually defined him was gone now. "You want to know how I feel?" he said, his voice trembling slightly. Not from fear, but from the sheer effort to contain himself. "I feel like I walked into a courtroom instead of a talk show. I feel like you decided to prosecute me the moment I sat down, and you're not interested in anything I actually have to say." Joy smirked, her tone dripping with condescension. "Maybe that's because what you have to say isn't worth hearing," she said cruelly. "Maybe people are tired of your sob stories and your victim complex." The words landed like a slap. The other hosts looked horrified. Sarah Haynes stared at her hands, refusing to look up, while Sunny Hostin's eyes darted toward the producers off camera, silently pleading for someone to step in and end the madness. But no one moved. The cameras kept rolling. Victim complex? Johnny's voice rose sharply now. "You sit here every day judging people you've never met, making assumptions about situations you know nothing about, and you want to talk to me about victim complexes?" "I know what I've read," Joy shot back. "I know what the courts have said. I know what multiple people have testified to under oath." Johnny stood up abruptly, the force of his movement sending his chair rolling backward with a loud scrape. The sound echoed across the silent studio. His face was flushed now, his eyes blazing. "Do you?" he demanded. "Or do you just know what gets ratings? Because that seems to be all you care about." The crowd was silent. Even Joy, for the first time, looked uncertain. She stayed seated, but her confident posture had faltered. "Sit down, Johnny," she said, trying to sound authoritative, though her voice wavered slightly. "You're being ridiculous." Johnny laughed bitterly, a low, humorless laugh that sent chills down the room. "I'm being ridiculous. I came here to talk about a film that employed hundreds of people, that might bring some joy to audiences. And instead, you want to relitigate my entire personal life on national television. And I'm the one being ridiculous?" "You're a public figure," Joy insisted. "Your personal life is public business when it affects what?" Johnny interrupted, his voice sharp as glass. "When it affects your ability to feel morally superior. When it affects your ratings? 'Cause that's what this is really about, isn't it, Joy?" Joy's face was turning red now, part anger, part embarrassment. "How dare you question my motives?" she snapped. "I'm trying to give our viewers the truth about who you really are." Johnny took a step closer to the panel table, his voice low and seething. "The truth?" he repeated, almost whispering. "You wouldn't know the truth if it walked up and introduced itself. You deal in gossip and speculations, and you call it journalism. I deal in facts," Joy fired back instantly. "Something you seem allergic to." Johnny leaned in slightly, eyes locked on hers. "Facts," he said slowly. "Here's a fact for you, Joy. You've spent the last 10 minutes trying to destroy me on television. Not because you care about justice or truth, but because you enjoy it." The studio fell deathly quiet. Not a single person moved. Even the sound of the cameras felt distant. What had started as a morning interview had transformed into a televised reckoning, and everyone watching, both in the studio and at home, knew they had just witnessed something unforgettable.